Hey, Redcon Raider here. Today's video is dedicated to the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible. With special thanks to Revenant, Aloise, A Nerd in Warpaint, Dragon Matrix 7, Excelsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Thomas Pietkowski, Trip Hop and Skip, and Valenrook. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. And welcome back to Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, as we settle in for another nice, casual reader episode. The Dreadlich Zacharias lies dead at our feet, the spoils of his ancient and crumbling library at our fingertips. I think we've got about a dozen new books and assorted notes to go through, which should hopefully give us more background and context for the setting. That said, we do have quite a bit of ground to cover here. Zacharias' dungeon was like 60% library, so let's jump right in. Starting with Crusade Chronicles. In the year 4606, the expanses of Sarkoris were tainted by the swollen abscess of colossal proportions that was the Worldwound, a tear between Golarion and the Abyss that let thousands upon thousands of demons onto the material plane. In the long years that followed, the Khelids of Sarkoris either fled or fell, outmatched, while fighting for their home. In the year 4622, the Church of Iobaria announced the beginning of the First Crusade, a blessed war against the demons that had destroyed Sarkoris and now threatened neighboring lands. Valiant warriors led by Queen Galfrey herself pushed the abyssal servants away from their borders and returned home victorious. The year 4630 marked the end of the First Crusade. Numerous fortresses and garrisons were established in those years in former Sarkorian lands, the outposts duty-bound to watch over Mendev's borders. After 8 years, in 4638, the Worldwound suddenly expanded to 4 times its previous size, unleashing new, monstrous hordes. The worst of the blows suffered by the Crusaders was the loss of Dresden, a fortress city that used to serve as a base for many a military operation. The Second Crusade was called, which claimed countless lives, yet never resulted in victory. Only with the creation of the Wardstones was the demon invasion stopped, as the lucent Iomede's magic stood as an impenetrable wall, blocking the invaders' path. In the year 4645, after 7 years of arduous and mirthless war, the Second Crusade came to an end. The Third Crusade was declared in 4665, but this time the Crusaders were fighting a war within their own ranks as well. Over the years, many abyss-serving cultists and spies had found their way past Mendevian defenses. The Third Crusade reached the apex of an inquisition that mercilessly purged heresy and demon worship by fire and sword. The crusade was called off in 4668, after the atrocities of interrogators had provoked sufficient upheaval and discontent among the populace. The Fourth Crusade was instigated by demons in the year 4692, when they broke through the protective barrier of the Wardstones. With righteous fury, the champions of Mendev fought the demons for 15 years, aiming to put an end to the old threat. But by the conclusion of the Fourth Crusade, which ended in 4707 due to a shortage of supplies and manpower, decisive victory was just as remote a possibility as it had been for all of the previous crusades. Which brings us to our current wildly successful Fifth Crusade. But yeah, that looks to be a basic Cribs Note version of the previous 4 crusades, similar to what Nura told us last time around, but with some harder dates and additional details. For example, I think that's the first time we've actually heard of any demons breaching the Wardstone barrier. So it has happened before. Eternal Sunshine, a Pilgrim's Journal. I failed to resist temptation and quickly doused my weary feet in the holy waters of the oasis. I washed my feet off first, for it would never do to desecrate a divine font with the dust of the road. A sunset danced upon the surface of the water. I closed my eyes as my flesh went numb, in yearning anticipation of a miracle. On the road, pain had gnawed at my heart, but now it melted into the holy water, and my sores seemed to fade away. I looked into my heart and questioned the purity of my thought. Was I worthy enough to escape my torment? Would Sarenrae give me a sign? I was prepared to greet the sound of flapping dove wings. The fever overwhelmed me. I sensed the divine rays, but the sun had set. The light was coming through my eyelids. I witnessed the figures of Sarenrae and her angels. I dared open my eyes, but they were heavy, as if burdened with all the weight of the sun's heat. Sleep dawned upon me. Interesting. I'm not really sure what to make of that one. At face value, it's a traveling priest of Sarenrae, feverish and weary, who comes upon an altar or an oasis dedicated to Sarenrae and washes their feet in the holy font, something which they give a negative connotation to. And then they pass out. Maybe it's a metaphor. Know Thy Enemy, a Crusader's Brief. Publishing funded by the Brotherhood of Crusader Adherents. Remember, Crusader, your foes are many, and each one is devious in its own way. In the lands of the Worldwound, 2 demonic masters rule. Learn to distinguish their influence and their followers. Discari is a demon lord who commands locusts and other crawling pests. It is an all-devouring wave that sweeps away all that is bright, majestic, and pure, leaving behind nothing but decay and ashes. For 100 years, this evil fiend and his lackeys have been sowing death and suffering all across Golarion, sending one horde after another through the Worldwound and onto our plane. Discari's visage is hideous, for his essence is a horrid crossbreed of humanoid and insect, and behind his back are fluttering wings woven from swarms of insects. Born of 2 demons, Discari despises both his brethren that were once mortal and his own human followers. Knowing of this disdain, the cleverest of his cultists seek ways to transform themselves into full-blooded demons. And to this end, they attempt some of the vilest experiments on their own flesh. Discari has been behind the horrors of the Worldwound ever since its creation. However, the other demon lord, Baphomet, joined him only at the onset of the Third Crusade. The goat-headed demon lord is cunning and slippery, and where his unholy kin makes his way through brute force, Baphomet prefers deceit, corruption, and backstabbing. Many noble houses trying to preserve their veneer of exalted dynasties keep to the worship of Baphomet as a family tradition. In truth, the cultists who call themselves Templars of the Ivory Labyrinth are searching day and night for weaknesses in the Crusaders' ranks. A doubtful mind to corrupt, a wavering heart to break, an ember of cowardice to fan. Beware of the cultists of Baphomet, for they may be standing right next to you, looking over your shoulder, and laughing at what you are reading. Pretty spooky. You're not a cultist of Baphomet, are you, Ellie? No, I didn't think so. So yeah, this appears to be a pretty basic synopsis of the 2 primary demon lords who are active during the 5th Crusade. Though I think there are others. I want to say the Lady Nocturne is also active. Or maybe she's just a bystander. I'm sure we'll find out more about that later. And then, obviously, we also just got hints that Cabriri may be getting involved. Though it is also possible that Nulkaneth is simply an outlier, a single worshipper of Cabriri who happened to join the invasion of his own volition. Night of the Witch by Maki Vanos. Sarkorian refugees, driven from their home, tried to get as far away from demon-corrupted lands as they could. Many of them, exhausted from their long travels or just unable to find acceptance among local residents, stayed outside already existing settlements. These communities remain to this day, and they all share a certain curious tradition. This celebration was seemingly established at the same time in all Sarkorian enclaves, even in the most distant ones. The event bears several names. Night of the Witch, Vorlesh's Verdict, Bonfire Night, among others. The preparations begin several days in advance. The adults craft an enormous effigy of the most hated servant of the Abyss, the witch Aurilu Vorlesh, who opened the tear between the two planes, and thus earned the titles Architect of the Worldwound and Betrayer of Humanity. The children, who are usually relieved from their chores, gather kindling in the nearby forest. Instead, they might ask their neighbors for some wood, traditionally voicing their request in the form of concern. They need something to warm the witch's feet. On the appointed day, the crowd places the effigy on a pole in the center of the settlement or neighborhood, where everyone can throw mud at it until sunset. At nightfall, cheers erupt as Aurilu Vorlesh's effigy burns to ash. It's worth noting that effigy incineration is so akin to an atrocious method of execution that guards and other enforcers often observe these festivities with great suspicion. However, any claims of the Sarkorians burning those suspected of demon worship in the place of an effigy are idle flights of fancy, lacking substance. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Given that Aurilu Vorlesh is the single individual most identified as being responsible for the destruction of ancient Sarkoris, it would stand to reason that the ancestors of said ancient Sarkorians would be keen on these sorts of symbolic rituals of vengeance. Especially since, from what we've read about ancient Sarkoris, they were originally a very vengeful and prejudicial society. Which does actually raise an interesting question. One which I'm sure will be further explored as we get deeper into the campaign. That being, was Aurilu Vorlesh always bent on evil? Would she have opened the Worldwound even if left to her own devices? Or was she driven to it by just or unjust persecution from the ancient Sarkorians? It could be a classic example of a self-fulfilling prophecy or vicious cycle of violence in trying to prevent the rise of arcane threats like Aurilu Vorlesh via draconian methods. It's entirely possible that ancient Sarkoris inadvertently created Aurilu Vorlesh. On the basics of sin magic. The roots of sin magic are the 7 virtues of rule laid down by Archmage Zin, sovereign of the Thessalonian Empire. According to his teachings, the virtues charity, generosity, humility, kindness, love, temperance, and zeal were a gift from one of the supreme goddesses of the empire, Lissala. Only just and wise rulers would be deemed worthy of receiving these high rewards. A metamorphosis, however, turned the 7 virtues into 7 sins. In Thassalon, the 7 strongest mages, named Rune Lords, had been made governors of each part of the vast empire that had grown beyond one human's control. Emperor Zin's reign ended when he died at the hands of his own stewards. With the emperor deposed and a puppet installed as his replacement, these Rune Lords became the true masters of their territories. Plotting against each other and warping Zin's tenets, the mages gradually perverted the 7 virtues, while becoming manifestations of these corrupt aspects. Greed, lust, pride, gluttony, envy, wrath, and sloth set into the lands of Thassalon, plunging the empire into the depths of depravity and profligacy, causing it to crumble from the inside. And even though Earthfall brought about the end of the nation, it did not put an end to the Rune Lords' misdeeds, for each of them had foreseen the calamity, and did all in their power to prevent their death in the disaster that destroyed Thassalon. Intriguing. That all seems to focus on pre-Earthfall stuff, so it's hard to say how that would really apply here. I think the only thing we've encountered thus far that would actually date that far back is the storyteller's origin, since he claims to have been an Archmage before Earthfall, who has somehow continued living for thousands and thousands of years since. I suppose it's possible that the storyteller's origin might tie in with the old Thessalonian Empire, but I imagine we'll get a better idea of that once we run into him again and we can start handing over all these notes we've been finding. That should unlock additional parts of his backstory. I suppose another possibility is that it does seem to imply here that some, or maybe even all, of the original Rune Lords are still kicking around. Given that, classically, of course, the 7 deadly sins were demons, I suppose it's possible we might encounter one or more Rune Lords as we get towards the center of the Worldwound? But again, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Sarkoris Lost. Absalom, published by the Foray Logos Archaeological Society. The middle of the plateau that formed central Sarkoris was the location of the region's capital, the city of Iz, the country's metallurgical heart. The rich mineral deposits of these lands had been known to the Kellids since ancient times, and over the long centuries, plenty of mines and workshops had sprung up here, and their output flowed into Iz. From here, traders led their heavily loaded caravans to other parts of Sarkoris and beyond. Many a wonder crafted by the Kellids over the years of their capital's prosperity disappeared without a trace with the demonic invasion and Iz's destruction. Local artisans were most skillful in their trade, which can be seen with the few surviving works of weaponsmithing, jewelry making, and metal casting arts. And while silver headdresses with ornate temple rings and lightweight sabers with hilts bearing their owner's initials can still be found in museums and private collections, other handcrafted examples of Iz's legacy are lost forever. Specifically, we, of course, only know of architectural landmarks of both secular and sacred variety through scarce descriptions. Meanwhile, local stonecutters were recognized throughout all Sarkoris, as many palaces, temples, and monuments, decorating other cities, were made by the hands of artisans from Iz. Okay, so basic information about ancient Sarkoris and the city of Iz in particular, which is now, of course, the primary demon stronghold at the center of the Worldwound. But aside from general lore, this really reads to me, as a dungeon master, as preemptive justification for the placement of powerful magic items in and around the city of Iz, basically throughout the ancient Sarkorian territories that we will be exploring in the subsequent acts. It's a small thing, but I do appreciate justification for loot placement. Sister of Mercy. Memoirs of the Second Crusade. By Nilin Malkister, Magnamar, Silverbank Spiritual Literature Publishing House. We gather again for the common evening prayer in the field chapel, all together setting aside our disagreements, or rather, politely pretending to have forgotten them. Arrows of sharp looks fly around the tent. The servants of Sarenrae look askance at the servants of Asmodeus. The priests of Gorum, who come to the prayer in armor covered with blood, make no attempt to conceal their disdain for those such as me, who are not rushing to the front lines of the battle. But what can I do if my weak, soft hands have been taught gentleness, not violence? I catch a glance of a priestess of Shaelin, squeamish, compassionate surely, and full of prim smugness. She would never stoop to do what I do for our fighters, but I know of no higher service. Some fellow believers told me that during times of war we must forget the tender side of the savored sting, and turn entirely to her formidable, punishing image, for there is no place for love on the battlefield. But I do not agree. Here, everyone is ready to punish. But who, if not us, will bring love? We kneel, and I pray to the unquenchable fire, "My lady, take my eyes, for they can no longer witness the horrors of the war, or see beautiful bodies broken and torn asunder. No longer can they cry for our allies, friends, and lovers." And the goddess replies, "My child, your eyes are a priceless treasure. As a lighthouse safely guides ships back to land during the storm, the light in your eyes brings heroes back from the bloody storm of battle." And I pray, "My lady, so shut my lips, for I can no longer kiss the skin, which I know by dawn will be sliced, bitten, and peeled." And the goddess replies, "My child, your lips are stronger than a sword, and firmer than armor plate. The whisper of your prayer gives strength to the fighters, and brings burning fire to the demons. The whisper of your prayer heals broken skin, so you may kiss it again. And I pray, my lady, burn out my heart. Let it find peace in the indifferent ash, for it can no longer withstand this pain. And the goddess replies, my beloved child, this pain is caused by the fire that burns in your heart, a fire so bright that everyone around it is comforted by its healing warmth. Do not dare turn to ash, but carry this heat to the very threshold of my chambers, where in the end you will find peace. Well, that is fascinating. Also, mildly inappropriate, but we'll ignore that for now. But yeah, this appears to tell the tale of a follower of Calistria during the Second Crusade, which is directly relevant to us because Vex is also a follower of Calistria. Not that it really comes up much. I think we've seen it maybe pop up once or twice in dialogue. They never explicitly name-drop her in this story, but they do use two of her prominent titles, the Savored Sting and the Unquenchable Fire. This story does actually touch on a very interesting subject, because Calistria is the chaotic neutral goddess of passion, which covers a wide gamut of things, pretty much anything I imagine you could feel passionate about, but most specifically, love and vengeance, and obviously Vex, and I imagine most other followers of Calistria who find themselves out in the Worldwound, is focused on the vengeance aspect. Though I suppose he also enjoys carousing from time to time, which means pretty much any time the opportunity presents itself. Drinking and stabbing, such is the life of a murder hobo. This story is unusual, though, in that it describes a follower of Calistria during the Second Crusade, who instead used passion for love to provide emotional and physical comfort for other Crusaders. Which, yeah, it makes sense. It's something that both Pathfinder games, I think, generally kind of dance around, but given the intensely traumatic and stressful environment that Crusaders would often find themselves in, I can certainly see how something like what she was offering would help keep people grounded. On a related note, my original plan for Vex was to make him flirtier, to really kind of play up the twin lust and vengeance angle. But after actually researching the various romance paths in Wrath, I've got to say, none of them really do it for me. There's a lot of serial killers and cannibals in the mix. And, that gets awkward. Also, I just watched Critical Role for the first time like a month ago, and I don't want to be discount Scanlan. Anyway, moving on. The Curse of Ancient Iobaria by Hastef Umme. Tell us, O teacher, why would Brevoy call us barbarians in the books you give us? The gods became angry with our homeland, my son. This land has devoured so many great empires, as if it was unwilling to bear life. There are centuries-old ruins around our settlement. They were ravaged by a star that fell from the sky. The kingdom of the Cyclops was the first victim of its curse. New settlers claimed this land 10 centuries later to establish a beautiful country named Iobaria, which stretched from the Lake of Mists and Veils to the Castrovan Sea. But the curse still lay upon these lands, and trouble came once again. Our ancestors suffered numerous maladies: the Tear Plague, the Char Death, the Choking Death. One after another, leaving only pain behind. People say that Ochib the Necromancer was to blame. But who knows? A great civilization was turned to dust. This is why I'm teaching you. Brevoy shouldn't make fun of you, or call you barbarians. That might be a carryover from Kingmaker. Brevoy, Iobaria, and the Cyclops Empire wiped out during Earthfall. Those are all much more relevant to the events of Kingmaker than they are to Wrath. It's been a while, but as I recall, there were Iobarian ore mines scattered across the northern end of Silverleaf's kingdom. And then, of course, Magar Varn, our neighbor to the east. He was practically tripping over ancient Cyclopean ruins. Just to put it in perspective, Iobaria is like 3 countries to the east of Sarkoris, where we are right now. You would head east past Heaven's Edge into Mendev, then you would cross the Lake of Mists and Veils, and then you would be in Iobaria, just off to the northeast of Magar Varn's ruinous kingdom. Man, Magar. I haven't thought about that guy in ages. I'm sure he's fine. The History of the Worldwound. Neurosian, published by the Royal Court of Mendev. Demons and their worshippers have long been active in the vicinity of Sarkoris. Even back in the year 4433, the Abyssal Hordes and Aren himself waged a grand battle in the region now known as the Worldwound. The forces of good had triumphed then, as the god of humanity defeated Deskari's minions and drove the surviving demons back, straight into the waters of the Lake of Mists and Veils. Why did the denizens of the Abyss have such keen interest in the northern reaches of Avestan? To the dismay of all mortal kind, Aurilu Vorlesh answered this question, and has consequently gone down in history as the architect of the Worldwound and the betrayer of humanity. Born of humans, this fiend felt such hatred towards her own kind, and was filled with such boundless selfishness that, for the sake of ascension and power, she pledged herself to the Abyssal Lords. An adept of the arcane jailed by the Sarkorians in the prison fortress of Threshold, she accomplished something that the Deskarites who perished in the lake had failed at previously. She ripped apart the planar fabric that had been thin in Sarkoris since days of yore. Her thought and will thoroughly corrupted to mirror the foulest depths of the Abyss, Aurilu Vorlesh forged a deplorable alliance with Deskari, and began hatching the heinous plan that she would put into motion in the year 4606. It was then that Aurilu and her accomplices performed the ritual that cut open creation itself like a knife, and left a festering tear in the material plane that would never heal. The Worldwound, connecting Golarion with the Abyss. By a tragic coincidence, or perhaps by some evil intent, the Worldwound was created mere weeks after Eridan's death. Millions of Eridan's followers and priests across the world were filled with the horror and despair normally reserved to orphaned children, partially explaining why humanity did not realize there and then the sheer threat of the newly opened Sarkorian portal. Taking advantage of turmoil in the mortal world, Deskari drove his forces to attack the defenseless Sarkoris, and Aurilu Vorlesh, who had been rewarded for her betrayal, started on her path towards demonic existence. Alright, another pretty basic primer, this time about the events immediately leading up to the opening of the Worldwound. They name-drop Threshold in this one, which is the prison where the ancient Sarkorians used to keep their high-risk magic prisoners, which, as I stated earlier, might have been the catalyst that drove Aurilu Vorlesh to do what she did, though that is pure speculation. We really don't know why she was there, only what happened after she escaped. And even then, we only know the broad strokes. It is interesting that they kind of openly speculate about Eridan's death being directly linked to the opening of the Worldwound. There are some possibilities there. I know from researching the Demon Lords that some Demon Lords have gained power by essentially killing and absorbing other Demon Lords. So that does make you wonder what would happen if they actually took down a god. I mean, that power does all have to go somewhere. That said, I don't think there's any actual official fate listed in any of the books. The Legend of the Pathfinder by Aren Roarvie. The door flung open. The three chaps sharing adventure stories fell silent. "Hail, friend," said the visitor in a deep voice. "Have you got room for me, master?" The bored half-elf behind the counter peered into the visitor's face and whistled. "Blimey, if it isn't Gregis Jeffs! Hail, friend, let me give you a room. Your gold is no good here." "No, I'll pay for it in full. That's what the society is for, helping and sharing." Gregis nods at the three chaps. "So there's my replacement. Have you held the confirmation yet?" "We've got one last trial to go," the youngest blurted out, and popped up from his chair. It's such an honor. I've read all the chronicles, all about your adventures. I heard you joined the Decemvirate, Gregis, another uttered. Oh, did you? You should cut off your ears then. They deceive you. Am I wearing a mask? You ain't? Good for you. A Pathfinder with no eyes is no good. I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in seeking. So, are you going to pour me a beer? And I'll tell you a couple of tales. Okay, yeah. That one's definitely from Kingmaker. I very distinctly remember reading that one before. The Decemvirate is the leading council for the Pathfinder Society. As the name implies, there are 10 members. Almost done. The Notes of a Traveling Priest, Against the Coven, by Tyrin. A traveling healer should enjoy a careless day of rest now and then. That is what I was thinking when I accepted an invitation to a wedding feast at a small Mendevian village near the Ostrovian forest. It was a hot summer, so the tables were set outdoors, in the midst of an apple orchard. I was seated between a sullen girl of about 15 and a cheerful old lady with a few scars on her face. The simple village dishes smelled wonderful. The musicians were playing cheerful tunes and slowly getting drunk, and the groom was glowing. The bride sat staring at the table, with her blue eyes every so often wandering to her flower crown. A frightening, unsteady howl came from somewhere beyond the orchard and broke the idyll. I turned to my elderly neighbor with a silent question in my eyes. It's Nelika's dog, the bride's. It went mad last night and won't stop howling, so they locked it up in the barn. Jealous of her mistress, no doubt. I quickly got up, and the adolescent girl who sat beside me followed along. It wasn't difficult to find and untie the dog. It was a huge shepherd, and it jumped up to greet me, apparently sensing the power and goodness in my faith. He whimpered quietly, almost crying. Then he ran outside and led us with him. We went down to a ravine in the shadows beneath some weeping willows. We were greeted by sad blue eyes gazing at us from a dead, pale face. The body of Nelika, the bride that we'd seen at the feast just a few minutes ago, had been pinned against the trunk of a dry tree by some horrible force. The dog sat at her feet and howled again. I ran back rapidly, praying to the goddess. I knew a monster that likes to kill young women to take on their appearance and destroy their family. These monsters worship powerful demon lords, the very embodiment of chaos, abomination, and evil. The powers of a humble healer would hardly be enough to stand against such an opponent, but how could I leave these people in such peril? I collected myself as I approached the doors of the bedroom, where they'd already taken the young couple. I flung open the door and exhaled the words of a prayer. An unnaturally large creature stood over the young man's body. It yelped at the blow that my prayer had dealt, and turned around immediately. Shimmering, steely gray skin, monstrous claws, ugly features. It was an Annis, the most horrible of hags. The illusion that made her look like Nelika had fallen, and the bride's flower crown sat mockingly on the matted hair of her huge head. She raised her hand, preparing to cast her spell on me, but a shaggy shadow leapt from behind my back and pinned the hag to the ground, clenching its fangs around her throat. The dog had come to avenge its owner. But hags don't hunt alone. Behind my back there was another Annis from the Coven, who had pretended to be the old lady at the table. A terrible claw reached out to me, but halted midair. "You," the hag whispered, baffled, and immediately fell from a blow to the throat. The adolescent girl wiped the blood from her hand and winked at me. Her eyes were different colors. One was blue, the other was green. Family matters. Well, priestess, shall we check on the poor groom? Alas, the happy village wedding turned into a funeral for the dead. Nelika and her elder relative who the hags had killed to sneak into the feast. At least we were able to save the groom. I was staring at the young man's icy eyes and the shaggy dog sitting at his feet, and I knew they wouldn't be staying much longer in the village. Soon the Meddevian Crusaders would have a new recruit and his dog in their ranks. 2 more souls with a grudge against demons, and those who follow them. Before leaving the village, I visited the girl, a foundling cared for by the village herbswoman. "Why did you decide to go against the Coven?" I asked her softly. "I was born 15 years ago, after a similar wedding. Hags often bear the children they conceive, after killing the bride and taking her place in the groom's bed. Such children usually follow in their mother's footsteps, but I decided I preferred to be human." I nodded. I might have not been able to rest carelessly at a celebration, but this was worth it. The child of a monster had stepped onto the path of redemption, and spared the world from the very evil that had spawned her. Interesting. Now, as I recall, we found this book in Chili Creek, and again, it's very on the nose. The setting is pretty much identical. Just like Chili Creek, a backwoods village on the edge of a Meddevian forest. Though in the case of Chili Creek, there's a mysterious patron involved, as opposed to a co-opted wedding. What did they call it? It was the Icy Rill? The offshoot of the Selin River? And of course, they also had that mysterious ritual they didn't want to talk about. The dolls hanging from the various trees around the village. Based on context and what we saw back in Kingmaker, I would guess we're looking at some sort of fae-like or hag-like creature that's co-opted the village and is using it as like a personal feeding ground, essentially providing protection for the village, allowing it to survive this close to the Worldwound. But in exchange for tribute, which could be travelers, visitors like Jurnog, or perhaps something else. I mean, whatever it is, you know it has to be something horrible. I think I actually mentioned it before when we were in Chili Creek, but it very much reminds me of Silver Step Village from Kingmaker, another similarly isolated village that, despite being surrounded by hostile creatures, is still mysteriously peaceful. I don't want to delve too much into spoilers for folks who haven't actually played Kingmaker, but suffice to say, it's very similar thematically to the end of this story. The idea of a monster going against its nature in an effort to protect people instead of preying upon them. Perhaps we've got something similar happening in Chili Creek, but with Icy Rill instead of a silver dragon. A letter to a noble Crusader. I hope this letter finds you in good health, Sir Willem. I see now with great sadness that you have quite forgotten and abandoned us. It's been 3 years since you visited your native lands, and your father at your family crypt. Last summer, some passers-by broke the lock on it and spent the night inside. As steward, I installed a new lock and cleaned up all the wreckage. Your servant who went missing, whom you inquired after in your previous letter, has indeed been seen, but at present his precise whereabouts are unknown. He came to us, looked at us with contempt, said something through his teeth, gathered taxes for you, ate a whole goose for free at the tavern, jumped on his horse, and galloped off. If he went missing somewhere on the road, we wouldn't know anything about it. It's been a complete disaster here, even without missing strangers to account for. 7 days ago, all cows gave black milk, and the milkman, who tasted it out of drunken stupidity, died in the pain of twisted bowels. There is something wrong with the spring. The water stinks of rotten eggs, and the cattle won't drink it. Besides, some scoundrel threw some dead dogs into the closest well, the one on the crossroads, so we filled it with soil. I expect the demons are giving us trouble any way they can. Our cattle are dying of thirst. Children are going missing in your protected forest. The woodcutters saw some scarecrows which they swore were alive. They spoke of angry faces and bared teeth. They were afraid to get too close and watch them from afar. Frightening things are going on in the woods. I fear that witches and demons have settled in your protected forest to do their wicked mischief. They are probably the ones who picked the bones of your servant who's gone missing, And you ask us, as if you suspect us of being involved. As if we could kill and rob an honest man. It's upsetting, Sir Willem. We never touched your servant. And if we did, he was a wretched man, smug and nasty. And we have no food or water, and our children are going missing. Instead of serving your Lady Galfrey, you should be home defending us, and bringing us food. You must have some gold, lord that you are. There is no one to protect us besides you. The city lads only come to find new recruits and take our gold. They don't have the authority to do anything more. And the send-off we give our lads and lasses they take. The whole village comes to say farewell, just like it's a funeral. None of them have returned home to the village yet. We are dying. So I'll tell you the honest truth, Sir Willem. We cannot live like that anymore. But we cannot die in such terrible conditions either. So we agreed with our neighbor to burn down your forest on the next new moon, your protected forest where the dark beasts live. We'll surround it, set it on fire from all sides, and hire a wizard to steer the wind. We won't be put off just because the forest is protected, or because no one may shoot game there or enter therein, or cut down its trees. Of course, you'll be very angry at us for burning down your family forest, because we've already been cutting its wood and shooting game there, for there is nothing else to eat and no other wood. We won't let the forest beast steal our children. If you wish, come and execute me. Execute all of us. But we won't put up with this any more. That's that. Respectfully, the steward of Vixola Village. 2. Lord Sir Willem. Wow, there is a lot to unpack there. Honestly, the way they lay it out, it almost sounds more like Fae than demons. Well, maybe not. The smell of rotten eggs from the river, that sounds like sulfur, which is a common sign of demons or possibly devils. The black milk sounds familiar, though the only thing that springs to mind is H.P. Lovecraft, the Black Goat of the Woods, which strays more into eldritch territory. Poison milk that twists the bowels. Makes me think of the milk sickness poisonings of the 19th century, when early frontier settlers accidentally let their cattle graze on white snake root, which was poisonous and would carry over in the milk, and then poison the people drinking it. The scarecrows, though, those are definitely a curveball because scarecrow golems are not commonly associated with demons, as far as I'm aware. In fact, I believe the only time we encountered a scarecrow golem in either Pathfinder game was the one just outside the witch's hut in Kingmaker, out in the middle of the swamp, which again implies Fae more than demons. It does make me wonder if the troubles in the village started before or after they started trespassing into the protected woods. If there were creatures, spirits, or Fae living in those woods, then cutting down the trees and preying on the animals could prompt those creatures to then prey on the village in turn. Sort of a tit-for-tat situation. I mean, obviously that's largely speculation on my part, but there are some interesting inferences throughout the letter. I have no idea if this is actually relevant in the grand scheme of things, but we do have two names coming out of it. Sir Willem and Vixola Village, so I guess we'll just have to keep an ear to the ground, see if either of those come up again. Anyway, I think that's about it. Minus the stuff we read in actual episodes, like Towards Eternity. Though we do still have a couple of relics we haven't looked at. Yeah, these two. Chillroar's hide and tusks. A Gowrow, an enormous reptilian beast, had once terrorized the riverside settlements of Sarkoris with its devastating attacks. The locals called it Chillroar for its thick, ice-covered hide, which no axe or lance could possibly penetrate, and its feral growl could blow a knight off a horse's back. Old, leery, and cunning, the beast satisfied its thirst for blood by destroying anyone who tried to kill it, and there was never a shortage of such brave yet foolish souls. While the small tribe of mountain giants worshipped the ancient Gaurau, the Sarkorian tribes considered Chillroar a grim threat, encouraging the rest of their warriors to try to defeat it in a feat of strength, which would be remembered for ages to come. Despite those heroes' valiant efforts, Chillroar managed to outlive its enemies. Sarkoris fell to the demonic onslaught. The creature's triumph did not last long, however. The opening of the Worldwound had changed the local landscape forever, draining many rivers dry and wrecking the Gaurau's lair. Finally, demons tracked down the legendary beast and brutally slayed it. Seems pretty straightforward. I don't think we've ever actually seen Gaurau or mountain lions in either of the Pathfinder games. We had hill giants in the first one, and obviously ash giants in this one. It is interesting, though, that they mention mountain giants worshipping the Gaurau, and then also that the ash giants worshipped its remains. I don't think there's any real connection between ash giants and mountain giants. For the most part, I think this story really just highlights what a nightmare the world was even before the Worldwound opened. Though I think we can agree the Worldwound is slightly worse. Pieces of the unholy symbol of Rovagug. The unholy symbol of Rovagug the Destroyer became infamous among the people of Eastern Sarkoris in the wake of the crimes of humpback Zerga, a bloodthirsty priest. Zerga was born with a body so twisted and broken that the infant's very survival seemed truly miraculous. The diseases and curses afflicting the wretched creature were so strong that no amount of healing magic could undo them. Zerga grew up to become a violent, rancorous man who despised love, friendship, and everything pure and kind. He turned all the hatred he had amassed over the years against the world that had humiliated him, and dedicated himself fully to the bloody ways of Gorum. Even his fellow priests considered Zerga to be irredeemably broken and evil, which in turn made him abandon them and turn to Rovagug instead. Dreaming of total annihilation and triumphant revenge for his suffering, Zerga gathered his own band of rascals, driven together out of fear, to commit brutal robberies and murder. The government of Sarkoris sent their militia squads eastward to bring Zerga and his cohorts to justice. But disaster struck when the Worldwound opened and their quest was curtailed. The humpback was among the few madmen who were not afraid of the demonic incursion. He even managed to turn the situation to his advantage by cowing some demon worshippers into submission. Zerga made them forget their former masters by demonstrating his unrivaled malevolent strength, and pursued his own unholy crusade. Even his own allies were not safe from his wrath, and eventually this became his undoing. Humpback Zerga was killed in his sleep by a group of treacherous followers. Legend has it that although they cut his throat precisely at midnight, the sinister brute of a priest continued to spit out profanities and curses until the first light of day. And once again, really kind of highlighting what a nightmare old Sarkoris was even before the Worldwound. Though at least in the case of the Gaurau, it was actually a natural creature. This one was man. I'll also say, if you are born with a series of debilitating malformations and diseases and curses, I feel like that would be a pretty major omen in a high fantasy setting like this one. Especially when you've got gods like Lamashtu in the mix. Regardless, I suppose this does also somewhat highlight the slippery slope that can lead one to end up worshipping Rovagug, the god of end times and destruction of all things. Although he's obviously far more extreme than Grotus or Gorum, there is some definite overlap there. And with that, I believe we're done. Oh wow, yeah, we're like an hour into it at this point. Let's go see if this unlocked any new bonuses, then we'll wrap this up. Nice, looks like we did get some this time. Crusade Chronicles. Plus 10 hit points. Simple and to the point, and useful for pretty much anyone. Know Thy Enemy, a Crusader's Brief. +1 insight on perception and stealth checks. Both of which are skills that Vex has, so yeah, that's very useful. The History of the Worldwound. +1 insight on religion and nature lore. Well, religion is wasted on Vex, but nature lore, he can use that. Nice, nice, very nice. Anyway, yeah, I think that's where we call it. That was, what, 14 books? Netting us 3 really nice bonuses. Well, technically 2.5, but who's counting? Me, I am. We also pulled a whole boatload of lore and context. Some really interesting stuff in there this time. The book on Calistria was fascinating, as was finding out more about the origin of the Worldwound, which obviously is going to be a major part of this overarching campaign. And then, of course, some books, like the one with the Hags, more directly relate to very specific side quests. Again, that book was very on the nose considering where we found it. At any rate, we're all out of lore items, so I think it's about time to hit the pause button. We're back to proper adventuring next time. Nulkineth awaits, as does all of the post-Creed content. But I really enjoyed this, and I'm sure it's just a matter of time before we track down enough lore items to justify another reader episode, which I am very much looking forward to. See you then. Oh, and remember, although I do love playing Pathfinder, Wrath of the Righteous, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the official social media feeds, or the official store pages. And if you'd like to help support the channel, then feel free to push the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. As always, links are in the description.